The morning sun stretched its first golden fingers across the vast expanse of the western plains, illuminating the ranch in a soft, amber glow. Dust swirled lazily in the early breeze, carrying the faint scent of dry grass and earth. At the edge of the property, a lone figure moved steadily, methodical in every motion. This was James Callahan, a man who had known more solitude than company in the past decade. He was a rancher by trade, a man molded by the land and its unforgiving demands. Yet he was shaped as much by the loss and isolation that had settled over his life like an unwelcome companion. James had inherited the ranch from his father, a rugged homestead that had weathered generations of storms and droughts. Since his father's passing, he had kept the property running alone, his hands roughened by years of labor, his face etched with lines of endurance. Every day followed a predictable rhythm, feeding the livestock, repairing fences, checking the water supply, and tending to the fields. The land demanded attention, and James had devoted himself to it with a single-minded diligence, often forgetting, or perhaps avoiding, the hollowness that lingered in his chest. Though competent in every task and strong in spirit, James carried the unmistakable air of solitude. There were no women to tend to the house or share the quiet evenings, no children to run across the yard, laughing and chasing the chickens. His only companions were the animals and the occasional crow perched on a fence post, cawing at the stillness. He spoke little, and when he did, it was mostly to the cattle or the wind, words swallowed quickly by the vast horizon. Some days the silence pressed in on him so heavily that even the sound of a creaking door or a rattling window pane felt like an intrusion, and yet a welcome one. James had known loneliness before, of course, but this was a deeper kind, a still, aching emptiness that clung to his bones. He remembered a love lost long ago, a young woman who had promised to join him here, only to leave for reasons he never fully understood. Since then, he had buried himself in work, convincing himself that a life of solitude was safer, simpler, and less prone to disappointment. Still, late at night, when the wind moaned across the plains and the stars blazed cold and distant above, he felt the sharp pang of longing, the unspoken wish for someone who might understand him, someone whose presence would warm the silence of his cabin. That morning, James paused on the porch, leaning against the rough-hewn rail. He squinted across the horizon, noting the familiar outlines of hills and fence lines, the way the sun struck the distant barn roof. There was comfort in the routine, yet the vastness of the land, as beautiful as it was, emphasized just how alone he truly was. His gaze lingered on the empty fields, and for a moment he allowed himself to imagine another life, one filled with laughter, conversation, and the warmth of a shared hearth. He shook the thought away, chastising himself for daring to hope. But life on the prairie had a way of testing even the most cautious hearts. As James turned back to tend to the morning chores, the wind carried a sound he wasn't expecting, a faint, irregular cry, distant but unmistakable. His brow furrowed, curiosity prickling against his caution. Solitude had taught him vigilance. He knew the land, and he knew danger, but also, perhaps, opportunity. Something or someone was out there. And for the first time in a long while, the prospect of another presence on the ranch stirred something unfamiliar within him: anticipation. James Callahan, the lonely rancher, had spent years guarding himself against disappointment, but the prairie had a way of breaking even the hardest hearts. Little did he know that the approaching figure on the horizon would soon change the quiet rhythm of his life forever. By late afternoon, the sky had begun to darken in ways that unsettled even a man as accustomed to the prairie as James Callahan. The soft blue of morning had given way to streaks of gray and ominous clouds that rolled across the horizon like smoke from a distant fire. The wind, usually a gentle companion to the ranch, had grown insistent, tugging at his coat and whistling through the wooden beams of the barn. James paused in the middle of mending a broken fence, his hands momentarily still. Something about the air felt charged, heavy with the promise of a storm. He squinted against the shifting light, scanning the horizon. The plains stretched endlessly in every direction, a sea of gold and brown swaying under the gusts of wind. He could see the ridge lines where the clouds clung low, darkening the earth beneath them. There was no rain yet, but the smell of it was in the air, an earthy, electric scent that made his skin tingle. James knew storms like this one could appear suddenly, fierce enough to tear through the fields, flatten fences, or send livestock into a panic. He redoubled his efforts, securing loose boards and double-checking the gates, the muscles in his shoulders straining with the work. As he worked, a faint sound reached his ears, almost lost in the growing roar of the wind. At first, he dismissed it as the wind itself, carrying a scrap of debris across the yard. But the sound persisted soft, irregular, like the hurried footsteps of someone struggling to keep their balance. James froze, his hands gripping the wooden post of the fence. He had lived alone for years, yet the instinct to help, ingrained from years of living with neighbors and community long past, flared up unexpectedly. He scanned the horizon more intently and caught a flicker of movement. A small figure, hunched against the wind, making a slow, staggering progress across the prairie toward the ranch. James squinted, trying to make out details through the sheets of dust and the long shadows of the clouds. It was a woman, he realized, her clothes plastered to her frame by the rain that had begun to fall in thin sheets. She was carrying something, or perhaps clutching her skirts against the wind, stumbling as she went. For a moment, James debated. He was a solitary man, cautious by necessity, aware of the dangers that came with strangers on a remote property. But he also knew that no one could survive on these plains unprepared, especially a lone traveler caught in a storm. Without thinking further, he dropped the fence post and ran toward the house, shouting over the wind. The woman's head lifted at the sound, and their eyes met for a fleeting instant. There was fear there, exhaustion, and something that tugged at James's careful reserve, a silent plea for help. By the time he reached the porch, the first heavy drops of rain began to fall, pounding the roof and soaking the earth beneath their feet. He opened the door quickly, holding it wide as the woman staggered in, shivering and drenched. Her eyes were wide, framed by strands of wet hair plastered to her face. She barely spoke, only murmuring, "I have nowhere else to go." James didn't hesitate. He ushered her inside, closed the door against the wind and rain, and guided her toward the fire he had started in the hearth. He noted how small and fragile she looked in contrast to the rough, wind-battered world outside. For all his years of self-imposed solitude, a flicker of something unfamiliar stirred inside him: curiosity, concern, and perhaps a cautious hope that this storm had brought more than just rain. As the wind howled outside, James knew one thing with certainty: the coming night would be unlike any other he had spent alone on the ranch. And whatever happened when the storm passed, the presence of this woman had already begun to change the rhythm of his lonely life. The cabin smelled of burning pine and the lingering scent of the earth outside, a mixture of rain, dust, and the faint tang of livestock. James Callahan guided the young woman to a chair near the hearth, where the fire crackled and cast a warm glow across the worn wooden floorboards. She sank into the chair with a shiver, her fingers trembling as she wrapped a threadbare shawl around her shoulders. Her clothes were soaked through, clinging to her form, and her boots had mud caked thick along the solace. I don't mean to intrude," she murmured, her voice soft but steady despite the evident exhaustion. "I'm supposed to meet someone, a husband, but he isn't there, and the storm. I didn't know where else to go." James watched her carefully, noting the weariness in her eyes and the faint lines of worry etched across her young face. She was perhaps in her early 20s, though the hardships of travel had aged her beyond her years. There was a resilience in the set of her jaw, the way she held herself upright, even when every fiber of her body begged for rest. He didn't speak immediately, only gestured toward a blanket he had kept folded on the bench. "Sit," he said gruffly, though not unkindly. "Warm yourself by the fire." She nodded, swallowing hard, and draped the blanket over her shoulders. For a moment they sat in silence, listening to the storm hammering against the roof and the wind moaning around the cabin walls. The sound was both threatening and oddly comforting, reminding James that the outside world was wild and unpredictable, but that here, in the firelight, there was a small measure of safety. Finally, she spoke again. I didn't know anyone out here would be kind. Most people I've met along the way, they didn't care. Or they wanted something in return." Her eyes met his, searching, wary. I have nowhere else to go tonight." James hesitated. He had lived by a simple, unspoken code. Help when you can, but trust slowly, if at all. Outsiders rarely survived long on the plains without caution, and strangers could be dangerous. But something in her voice, in the way she looked at him not with fear alone, but with quiet determination, moved something inside him. Perhaps it was the memory of a long-ago promise broken, or perhaps it was the recognition that even a man like him needed connection. "You'll stay," he said finally, his voice firm. "Just for the night. The storm will pass and you can decide what comes after. But tonight, you stay." Relief flickered across her face, so fleeting and genuine that it tugged at the corners of his heart. She murmured a quiet thank you, not extravagant, not pleading, just sincere. James busied himself with practicalities, fetching a dry towel, filling a basin with warm water, and offering her a simple meal of bread, cheese, and salted meat. The firelight danced across her features, highlighting the exhaustion and the faint hope in her eyes. She ate slowly, and as she did, James observed her closely. There was intelligence there, a sharpness that hinted at resourcefulness. She was no helpless girl. She had survived miles of unforgiving terrain alone, and that spoke of strength. The wind continued its relentless assault outside, but inside the cabin, an unexpected warmth began to grow. It was not just the fire, but something more subtle, a fragile thread of trust stretching between them, fragile yet undeniable. James, who had spent so long guarding his heart, realized that this woman's arrival was more than mere circumstance. In seeking shelter for the night, she had unwittingly stepped into a life that had known nothing but routine and solitude for years. And in that small, flickering firelight, both of them felt the first faint stirrings of change. The storm outside showed no signs of letting up, the wind rattling the cabin walls and rain lashing against the windows in relentless sheets. Yet inside, the cabin felt like a separate world, warm, safe, and strangely intimate. James Callahan had fetched an old wooden table from the corner and set out the modest meal he had prepared. Bread, a slab of smoked meat, and a few hard cheeses. The young woman, still wrapped in the blanket, hesitated only a moment before sitting across from him. For a while they ate in silence, listening to the storm's fury outside. The rhythmic pounding of rain on the roof created a steady backdrop, almost meditative. James noticed her glancing around the cabin, her eyes lingering on the worn furniture, the photographs of his family that lined the mantel, and the little touches of care he had taken to make the place livable. There was curiosity there, a spark of interest, tempered by the wariness that came from traveling alone through a harsh, unwelcoming world. Finally, she broke the silence. "This place, it's different from what I expected. I thought the West would be harsher, lonelier, but this feels like someone belongs here." Her voice was soft, carrying both awe and a hint of longing. James shifted in his chair, unsure how much to reveal. He had spent so many years building walls around himself that speaking of personal feelings felt almost dangerous. Yet the firelight, the storm, and the vulnerability in her gaze urged him forward. "I've lived here a long time," he said slowly. "The land keeps you busy, and if you're not careful, it keeps you lonely too. but you get used to it. Mostly. She nodded, as if understanding more than the words conveyed. I know what it's like to be alone, to keep moving because the world didn't give you a choice. I've traveled for months, thinking each town might offer something better, something safer. But it never does until now, maybe. Her words struck a chord with James. He found himself leaning back, allowing himself the rare indulgence of feeling understood. You've come a long way then. And alone, he said, noting the weariness in her posture. That takes more grit than most people have. She smiled faintly, the first hint of warmth he had seen on her face since she arrived. I had no choice. I had to keep moving. I had no home to return to, no one who could care if I fell behind. You're different. James felt an unfamiliar pull in his chest. He had spent so many years guarding against disappointment, against the intrusion of others, that the sensation of connection was almost startling. He realized, slowly, that this stranger, this mail-order bride with no place to go, was the first person in a long time to meet him without suspicion, without judgment. The conversation drifted then, gently, into safer waters. She spoke of her childhood, of a small town far from the plains, of dreams she had once held before the harshness of reality tempered them. James, in turn, shared stories of his father, the ranch, and the lessons learned from the unforgiving land. There were pauses, moments where the storm's roar seemed louder than their voices, but those silences were comfortable, not awkward. They were shared, a rare experience for two people who had known so much solitude. By the time the fire burned low and the storm outside softened to a persistent drizzle, a subtle bond had formed. Trust, fragile but undeniable, had taken root. The young woman had seen James's humanity, his capacity for kindness even when guarded, and James had glimpsed her resilience and determination. In that small cabin, as the night stretched on, they discovered an unexpected truth, that even the loneliest hearts could find a flicker of warmth when someone else dared to stay, to listen, to care. And as they prepared to rest for the night, the storm still raging outside, neither of them could ignore the quiet realization that the course of their lives might be changing forever. The first light of dawn crept slowly over the horizon, painting the plains in soft shades of pink and gold. The storm had passed, leaving behind a world washed clean, glistening with droplets on every blade of grass, every fence post, and every worn piece of wood on the ranch. The air smelled sweet and earthy, tinged with the freshness that only follows a long night of rain. James Callahan stepped outside, stretching his stiff muscles, the chill of the morning making him breathe deeply. He paused for a moment, surveying the cabin and the yard. His eyes caught on small details he had not noticed before the fence was straighter. The gate had been repaired neatly, and the mud tracks that had marred the barn entrance were smoothed and orderly. For a fleeting moment, he allowed himself a quiet wonder. The young woman had done all this while he slept, or while he had been preoccupied with securing the storm's damage. Inside the cabin, she had taken it upon herself to tidy the small living space. The fire had been banked overnight, the table wiped clean, and the small pile of dishes set neatly by the sink. Even the blankets on the bed had been folded with care. James looked at the room with a mix of astonishment and something warmer, something he had long forgotten. The presence of another person, someone willing to take initiative without being asked, had already begun to change the rhythm of his solitary life. He found her in the corner of the kitchen, kneeling beside the hearth, tending the last embers of the fire and humming softly under her breath. She looked up as he entered, startled for a moment, then smiled, a little shyly. "Good morning," she said, her voice warm, the fatigue of the night softened by a lightness that hadn't been there before. James cleared his throat, trying to mask the surprise in his tone. You did all this?" he asked, gesturing around the cabin and yard. "I didn't ask you to." "I know," she said simply, standing and brushing her hands on her skirt. "I just thought, if I'm going to be here, even for one night, I might as well help." You've done enough for me already." There was sincerity in her eyes, a humility that did not diminish the strength he had witnessed in her the night before. He felt a curious stir in his chest, a mixture of admiration and something deeper, an awareness that this woman's presence wasn't fleeting. She had come with nothing, yet her actions had already left a mark on the place he had called home for so long. The cabin felt brighter, the ranch more orderly, and even the air seemed lighter. For the first time in years, he felt that the monotony and loneliness of his life could shift, that someone else could bring balance, warmth, and perhaps joy. They stood in quiet companionship for a moment, watching the sunlight glint off the freshly washed wooden beams and the dew-covered grass. James realized that the night had revealed more than her resilience. It had shown her kindness, her care, and her ability to act without prompting, a rare combination that he had longed for without knowing it. As he handed her a warm cup of coffee, he said quietly, almost to himself, "I reckon you might be more than just a visitor here." She smiled, understanding more in his words than he had explicitly said, and the spark of possibility hung in the morning light between them. The storm had passed, leaving the world renewed, and in that clarity, James saw the truth. The arrival of this woman was no accident. She had already begun to transform his life, not through words or promises, but through action and courage. And in the soft glow of dawn, the lonely rancher realized that his life, as solitary as it had been, was about to change forever. The cabin was quiet now, the storm long gone, leaving only the gentle crackle of the fire and the soft chirping of birds outside. James Callahan sat at the small wooden table, his coffee cooling in the cup he held, while the young woman moved about, tidying the few things left out from the night before. The morning light spilled across the floor, illuminating the small, homely space in a way that made it feel intimate, almost sacred. For a long moment, neither spoke. The shared effort of surviving the storm had forged an unspoken bond, but words were still cautious, measured. Finally, she broke the silence, her voice softer than before. "I've never been anywhere like this," she admitted, glancing around the cabin. "I've traveled a lot, seen a lot of people, but no one has ever offered me kindness without asking for something in return." James studied her, noting the vulnerability behind her calm exterior. He had spent so long alone, so long guarding his heart against disappointment, that the weight of her honesty struck him with unexpected force. "I don't often let anyone in," he said slowly, carefully. "I've learned the hard way that people leave, or they don't care. I've been alone most of my life, and it's easier to keep it that way." She paused, setting down the dish she was holding, and looked at him with a quiet intensity. "I know what that's like," she said. "I grew up thinking I had to fend for myself, that I couldn't rely on anyone. I've learned to trust very carefully, sometimes too carefully. But last night, you showed me that there are still people who will help without expecting anything back." James felt a strange warmth in his chest, a tugging at the part of him he had tried to bury, the part that still longed for companionship, for understanding. "It's been a long time since someone needed me," he admitted, the words rough and uncertain. "Not just because of my work, but because I let people in too easily once. Lost more than I could bear." The young woman stepped closer, her voice lowering, almost confessional. "I've carried my own share of losses," she said. "Dreams that didn't come true, people who let me down. That's why I travel cautiously, why I keep moving. But last night, I felt safe. More than I thought I could." James nodded slowly, feeling the weight of her words settle alongside his own. There was an understanding there, silent and profound, that went beyond simple conversation. They had each been shaped by hardship, by loneliness, by disappointment, but in this moment, in the quiet aftermath of the storm, they saw in each other something rare: recognition, empathy, and the glimmer of trust. He exhaled, the sound heavy but relieving. Maybe Maybe it's not too late for either of us, he said, almost to himself. Maybe there's a chance for something different, something real. Her eyes softened and she gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. I'd like that, she whispered. If we're willing to try. And just like that, the unspoken barriers that had kept them both isolated began to crumble. The honesty they shared, the confessions of fear, loss, and cautious hope had forged a new connection, one built on mutual understanding rather than mere circumstance. For James Callahan, the lonely rancher who had resigned himself to solitude, it was a revelation that trust could be given again, and that someone had arrived in his life not as a fleeting visitor, but as a person capable of changing everything. And for the young woman, the night had become more than shelter from a storm. It had become a beginning, a fragile yet undeniable step toward belonging. The day stretched lazily across the plains, sunlight spilling over the rolling hills and warming the cabin walls. James Callahan moved about the ranch with a quiet, deliberate energy, but his mind was elsewhere. He found himself stealing glances at the young woman as she helped with small chores, feeding the animals, gathering firewood, and arranging supplies with an ease that surprised him. Each movement, each thoughtful action, seemed to echo a truth he had long tried to ignore. She was capable, kind, and remarkably resilient. As he worked, memories of his long years of solitude pressed against him. He had built walls around his heart as firmly as he had built fences around his land. To allow anyone in to consider a future beyond his isolation felt dangerous, like stepping onto unstable ground. Yet he couldn't deny the pull he felt when he watched her laugh softly as she coaxed the chickens back into the coop, or when she looked at him with quiet curiosity as they sorted hay bales together. By mid-morning, they paused at the edge of the barn, leaning on the fence to catch their breath. The wind carried the scent of fresh-cut grass, the faint tang of the earth, and the promise of a new day. James found himself speaking before he could stop himself. "I've lived like this a long time," he said slowly, glancing toward her. "Alone, thinking that maybe it was easier, safer, but now I can't stop thinking about what it would be like if you stayed. Not just tonight or next week, but for good." Her expression softened, a gentle warmth spreading across her features. "I've wondered the same," she admitted. "I've traveled for so long, thinking the world wouldn't care if I survived or not. But here, I feel like I could belong. That maybe this could be more than just a stop along the way." The weight of possibility hung between them. James felt the tug of fear. Change was terrifying, even when it promised something good. He thought of the quiet nights alone, the routine he had grown accustomed to, the unpredictable challenges of opening his heart to someone new. And yet, alongside that fear, there was something stronger, hope. A hope that perhaps he didn't have to face life alone anymore, that the presence of this woman could transform the loneliness he had accepted for so long. They worked together in silence for a while, their movements coordinated as naturally as if they had done this for years. Each gesture, each shared task, was a quiet confirmation of their growing partnership. By the time they stepped back to survey the barn and the yard, James realized that the land itself felt lighter, more alive. The prospect of a shared life, once terrifying, now held a strange allure. "I don't know what tomorrow will bring," he said finally, his voice low and contemplative. "But I do know that I'd like you here, with me. Not just for tonight, not just for the work or the chores. With me." Her eyes glistened in the sunlight, and she smiled softly. "I want that too," she said, the simplicity of her words carrying the weight of promise. "I want a place where I belong. And I think I found it here with you." In that quiet, sunlit moment, the turning point became undeniable. The rancher who had lived his life in solitude realized that the possibility of change was no longer abstract, it was real, tangible, and terrifyingly beautiful. And the young woman, whose journey had been defined by uncertainty, recognized that the path she had longed for might finally be within reach. For the first time in years, James allowed himself to imagine a future where loneliness did not define him, a future that included warmth, partnership, and a shared life on the plains. And with that thought, the invisible walls that had encased his heart began to crumble, making space for something entirely new: hope. The evening sky stretched across the plains in shades of amber and violet, the last light of day reflecting off the distant hills. James Callahan sat on the porch, the wind carrying the scent of fresh earth and the faint trace of smoke from the hearth. The young woman moved quietly inside, tending to the last of the chores, her presence calm but steady, a reminder of how much the small shared moments had begun to matter. James's mind was restless, turning over the events of the past 24 hours. The storm, the shared efforts to save the cabin and secure the ranch, the confessions they had exchanged, everything pointed to a single truth he could no longer ignore. He had spent years guarding his heart, convincing himself that solitude was safer, easier. But now, as he watched her move with quiet competence and grace, he realized that the life he had accepted for himself could be different. Finally, he rose from the porch and stepped inside. She looked up from the hearth, her eyes meeting his with an understanding that needed no words. For a moment, they simply regarded each other, the weight of unspoken emotions filling the space between them. Then James spoke, his voice steady but soft, carrying the gravity of his decision. "I don't want this to be just a night," he said, gesturing to the cabin and the land around them. "You came here when you had nowhere else to go. And you've shown me more than I thought anyone could. You've changed this place, and me. I want you to stay, permanently, not because it's convenient, not because it's expected, but because I want you here, with me." Her eyes widened slightly, a mixture of surprise and hope shimmering in their depths. She took a careful step toward him, closing the small distance that had always felt so wide. "James, Her voice faltered, then steadied. "I want that too. I've traveled a long, lonely road, and I thought I'd never find a place to belong. But here, I do. With you, I want to stay. I want to build something with you." A small, genuine smile tugged at the corners of his mouth, the first in a long time. He reached out, gently taking her hand, feeling the warmth and strength in her grip. In that simple touch, the promise of partnership, trust, and shared life was sealed. They spent the remainder of the evening together, talking quietly about the future, about the small practicalities of life on the ranch, about hopes and dreams long set aside, and about the ways they could support one another. For the first time, James allowed himself to imagine a life that included someone else in every daily moment, the laughter, the companionship, and even the challenges. And she, for her part, embraced the idea of a home not as a mere stop along her journey, but as a shared space where they could both thrive. Outside, the stars emerged, brilliant against the clear night sky. Inside, the cabin felt warmer, brighter, alive with a sense of possibility and connection. The storm had passed long ago, but its echoes remained a reminder of how unpredictable life could be, and how a single night of compassion and courage could alter the course of two lives forever. James and the young woman sat together on the porch, hands intertwined, watching the quiet world settle into night. They had made a choice, a commitment to one another, and to the life they would build side by side. And in that moment, the lonely rancher understood fully that some decisions, though terrifying, were worth every risk. The future stretched before them, uncertain but promising, and for the first time in many years, James Callahan felt something he had almost forgotten: hope, love, and the unmistakable warmth of belonging. Seasons passed over the sprawling plains, each leaving its mark on the land and on the lives of James Callahan and the young woman who had once arrived at his doorstep seeking shelter. The ranch, once quiet and solitary, now thrummed with life. The fences were sturdy, the fields well tended, and the barns filled with healthy livestock. Small improvements and touches from her hands flowers planted near the cabin. A cozy hearth corner, freshly painted shutters gave the homestead a sense of warmth and welcome that had been absent for years. James moved through his days with a lighter step. The weight of loneliness lifted. Tasks that once felt like burdens now felt shared, their completion sweeter because they were accomplished together. Mornings began with laughter echoing across the fields as the young woman worked alongside him, teaching him small tricks she had learned during her travels while he showed her the ways of the land, the subtle signs in the soil, the sounds of approaching weather, the temperaments of the animals he had known for years. Evenings were quieter, more intimate. They cooked together over the fire, sometimes in silence, sometimes sharing stories of their pasts and dreams for the future. Conversations that had begun with cautious trust now flowed easily, punctuated by laughter, teasing, and the occasional comfortable silence that comes only when two people truly belong together. The cabin, once a space of survival, had become a home filled with life and hope. Neighbors occasionally passed by, noting the change in the rancher who had once seemed distant and reserved. They remarked on the vibrancy of the land, the way laughter now carried across the fields, and the unmistakable partnership that had grown between him and his wife. James, once a solitary figure on the prairie, now walked with a quiet pride, not just in his work, but in the bond he had cultivated, the life he had built alongside her. The young woman, too, had changed. The journey that had begun with uncertainty and fear had transformed into a life of belonging, purpose, and joy. She had found a place where her skills, her strength, and her heart were not only valued but essential. Her laughter now mingled with James's in a harmony that was both new and familiar, and she no longer feared the solitude of the plains. She had found companionship, love, and a home. Together they faced the inevitable challenges of ranch life storms, illness among the livestock, and the occasional setback, but each obstacle was met with shared determination and unwavering support. Where once James had faced life alone, he now faced it alongside someone who complemented his strengths, softened his weaknesses, and understood him in ways no one else ever had. On warm evenings they would sit on the porch, hand in hand, watching the sun dip below the horizon, painting the sky with colors as vivid as the life they now shared. In those quiet moments, the memories of the night she first arrived, the storm, the fear, the shared struggle faded into something almost dreamlike, yet their significance remained. That single night had changed everything, setting in motion a series of events that reshaped their hearts, their home, and their future. James Callahan, the lonely rancher who had once believed solitude was his only companion, now understood a truth he had long denied. Life was richer when shared, and love could arrive in the most unexpected ways. And the young woman, who had sought shelter with nowhere else to go, had found far more than safety. She had found a life intertwined with another's, a love grounded in trust, courage, and unwavering devotion. Together, they had turned the quiet ranch into a home, their solitude into companionship, and their fleeting encounter into a lifetime of shared memories. In the end, the storm had passed, not just from the plains, but from their hearts, leaving behind a life forever changed, full of hope, belonging, and the promise of countless sunrises yet to come.